So we finish with the language of anatomy by looking first at the abdominopelvic cavity. And this is a really large cavity with a lot of critical organs. So from a clinical perspective, you want to be able to understand the location of these organs relative to each other. And you can do that a couple ways. You could visualize this big cavity as quadrants, and you could even visualize it as regions. And we're going to look at both, starting with quadrants. So if you divide that abdominal pelvic cavity into four quadrants, you just call them the upper right, upper left, lower left quadrants, or whatever combination of those terms there is. And you really want to be able to not just visualize this, but ideally sketch out what this abdominal pelvic cavity looks like. It doesn't have to be fancy. Here's just a real basic sketch. Uh, I'm no artist, so I'm going to try to do this with a mouse since I don't have a stylus. But together, we'll just sketch on some of these major organs so you can figure out what quadrants they're found within. And if you are going to sketch this at home, one of the first things you'll want to do is use the belly button, the umbilicus, to draw out a plus sign to make the quadrants and figure out roughly where you want your diaphragm to be, that big muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. Then the first thing I'm going to do is draw the liver because the liver is enormous. The liver takes up much of the upper right quadrant and moves over into the upper left as well. And the gallbladder kind of hangs out underneath there. Once I've got the liver in place, then I like to do a bunch of other digestive organs just by following the path of food, meaning that food will come down your esophagus, which will drop the food into your stomach. Stomach's kind of this J-shaped sac. And from the stomach, the food moves into the small intestine. So this is just kind of a really messy long tube. I'm just going to draw it like a curvy tube like this. And you'll see that the small intestine, it's actually crossing over into all four of the abdominal pelvic quadrants. But where does the small intestine end? Well, it ends in the lower right abdominal pelvic quadrant at a pouch called the cecum. Here I'm going to do CE for cecum. And hanging off the cecum is the appendix. Now, the cecum and the appendix, those are both part of the large intestine. And of course, they're not very large. That's not all there is. The biggest main part of the large intestine is the colon. And the colon actually comes up, crosses over, and goes down and kind of squiggles around. Just like the small intestine, the large intestine is found in all of the abdominal pelvic quadrants. Here's large intestine, here's small intestine. Large intestine eventually turns into rectum. Rectum becomes the anus. So, it doesn't have to be pretty. I mean, I don't know that anyone will ever ask you to actually sketch this out when it's important, but this is just one step to help lock it into your head where these organs are found. Yet, we're not even done with digestive organs. What about the pancreas? That's a pretty important major organ. So let's sketch out the pancreas, which tends to hide here kind of behind the stomach. Pancreas on there. Okay, let's do a few other organs. And because they will be from other organ systems, let's see, we'll do, how about the urinary organs? The kidneys are found in your upper abdominal pelvic quadrants. Here's a kidney. Here's another kidney. And kidneys will drain urine into ureters. Travel down, down, down behind a lot of these other structures. Until they reach the bladder, of course. Here's the bladder. Now, in addition to urinary structures, there is also some reproductive structures. So like in a female, we could put the uterus somewhere around here with the fallopian tubes extending out to the ovaries. A little O inside those ovaries and a U inside the uterus. And finally, I'll throw a spleen on up over here. Here's the spleen. Okay, that looks pretty good for your first day. We've got organs from lots of different organ systems. And I'm remembering we better throw in a male reproductive organ here. It's called the spermatic cord. We'll just make a little tube. Spermatic cord. That's a tube that'll carry the sperm up past the bladder and so it can enter the penis. So that's better. Now we've got a bunch of organs, kind of messy, but again, this is just to help you practice with these terms, with these organs. You've got a partial visualization here of some of the major organs in those quadrants. And for a text-based version, you can read through here, and I specified things like when you look at the small and large intestine, it's going to tell you, well, which part of the large intestine? Only the colon comes up into the upper quadrants, but there are other parts of the large intestine in the lower quadrants. So I believe everything that we drew is on this page. Here's the thing. A quadrant is still pretty big. So when you become even more advanced, you can pinpoint issues to an abdominopelvic region. And there's 9 of these in the abdominopelvic cavity. So we're not going to actually try to assign all the specific organs into each of these regions, but we do want to know the names of these regions. So let's start here. I took this picture for you this morning of myself. And what I want to do is, rather than just show you the answers, here's a list of these regions, and we will put these on our image one at a time. And you can start pretty easy with the umbilical region, because if you find the belly button, that's the umbilicus. So here's the umbilical region. Then we know that the stomach is sitting roughly up in here. Let me change pens. So the top of the stomach is up here. And in fact, epigastric means on top of or above the stomach. So epigastric kind of makes sense. Hypogastric means below the stomach. Kind of way below the stomach. I didn't invent the names, but this is kind of making some sense. Then we have the lumbar region, left and right lumbar region. So the lumbar is the lower back, not too low, not down here. These are going to be the lumbar regions. Next is hypochondriac. Well, hypo means below, but that might not be enough to help. Chondra means cartilage. And this is going to be kind of a stretch, but do you know that your ribs come down and then they stop? And right about here, they turn into cartilage. And it's actually cartilage that connects the rib to the sternum. So if you were to open up your skin here, right under here, under your skin would be cartilage. So under here is cartilage. Hypochondriac means under the cartilage, which just leaves inguinal. Inguinal, we mentioned in a previous video, means basically groin in Latin. So this is getting pretty close to your groin region. So you want to know the names of those regions, but things get really hairy when you try to say what organ is in each, because some of them, like the liver, are going to cross over a whole bunch of regions. Here's your key. And on we move to body cavities. Internal chambers in which your organs are attached. Some are suspended to these cavities, kind of hanging there, and they're protected by these cavities. There's two major cavities, dorsal and ventral. The dorsal cavity has got your brain and your whole spinal cord inside it. So that's just one big space, right? Because your brain and your spinal cord are attached to each other. So there has to be one big space. But you can be more specific. The cranial cavity has your brain inside it, and the spinal cavity has your spinal cord in it. Things get a little more interesting in the ventral cavity. So in the ventral cavity, you have both the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. So everything, really the front part of your body from like neck to groin. The easiest way to visualize this, I think, is imagine you've got a cadaver or a patient, if you can pull this off. You've hollowed out the thoracic cavity, you pulled out all the major organs, and you're looking in here. And now you've got the lungs, and you're supposed to save your patient, okay? So reassemble them. Take the lungs, and you see where they go, and you put the lungs into that space. Well, you've just found the pleural cavities. Those are spaces for the lungs. But then there's still this big opening, this big cavity down the middle in between the lungs. Well, that space we call the mediastinum, which translates to the middle space, which makes sense. So the mediastinum is where when you breathe, air comes down through the trachea. When you swallow, food comes down through the esophagus. When your heart beats, blood sprays up through the ascending aorta. And blood drains in through the superior and inferior vena cava. The point is, all these big, large tubes are located in this middle space called the mediastinum. So let's say you put all these tubes in there, and you're going to stitch up your patient, but you almost forgot the heart, important one. So you've got the heart, and you look, and you can tell right where it goes because there's a space left there for the heart called the pericardial cavity. So specific spaces for specific organs, and they each have different names. Then you do the same with the abdominal pelvic cavity. Hollow everything out. You can see perhaps that there's a subtle differentiation between the abdominal portion of the abdominal pelvic cavity and the pelvic portion. Whether or not there's like a discrete line or structure that separates those is kind of debatable. But regardless, you've got this big opening, and you know that some organs will go more towards the top in the abdominal cavity, some will go more inferiorly in the pelvic region of the abdominal pelvic cavity. There is one kind of unique thing about the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is that there is this thing called the peritoneal cavity. Only some organs are embedded within this cavity. And in our diagram, you can see that it's just the abdominal region, and part of the pelvic region is wrapped up in a membrane called the peritoneal membrane. So this is kind of strange. If you sit on that for a minute, we're going to come back to it. Here's another way to look at these cavities, to think about how everything in that front part of your body is your ventral cavity. Within the thoracic cavity, you have the pleural cavities and the mediastinum, which contains the pericardial cavity. And in the abdominal pelvic cavity, you have the abdominal part and the pelvic part. And then with this special peritoneum that's in there. Here's one more way to look at this. And what I've also indicated here is that the pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity and the peritoneal cavity make up something that I call, and maybe others, the three P's. The three P's are very important. You're going to get sick of hearing about the three P's very quickly. But the three P's are serous membranes. So here's the story. The heart, the lungs, and some of your abdominal pelvic organs are wrapped in special membranes called the serous membranes. These membranes are just named after the cavities, okay? So the pleural membranes line the pleural cavities, and the pericardial membrane lines the pericardial cavity, and the peritoneum, or peritoneal membrane, lines the peritoneal cavity. So what are these membranes? Well, serous means watery. So they're watery membranes, but how can a membrane be watery? Well, if it's double layered, as shown in these images, there will be a space in between these two layers where you can have the fluid. So there's fluid inside, trapped in between this double layered membrane. And the goal of this is provide perhaps a bit of cushioning, but it reduces friction as these organs move. So, which of your organs move? Well, not all of them. The heart pumps and moves. The lungs expand and contract and move. And much of your digestive organs, like especially your stomach and intestines, move. So these membranes are primarily found wrapping up around those organs to reduce friction so that every time your stomach churns a little more, it's not going to rub a hole in it. That would be bad. And the key to understanding these is actually realizing this is one membrane that's wrapped back around on itself. So we need separate names for this inner portion of the membrane and the outer portion of the membrane. So we call the portion of the membrane touching the organ the visceral layer, because your viscera are your organs. If you are eviscerated, then you have removal of your organs. If you have a visceral response to something, it's like a very powerful, comes from deep within you, from your organs perhaps. So it's a visceral response. Parietal means wall. Like these bones on the side of your skull are your parietal bones. So they're the outer walls of your skull. This concept is a little bit tricky, but it's pretty critical, not just because it'll help you get through this unit, but it's going to come up again when we talk about the respiratory system in the lungs, cardiovascular system in the heart, and the digestive system and some of those other organs that need to be surrounded by a serous membrane. So I have another video that you'll be watching that will give you a hands-on view starring me and some of my kids' toys to help you understand how these serous membranes work. Check it out.